proselytized. And for a long time, I kept quiet about my own enjoyment of weed. Hi. When I was invited here to give a talk on marijuana, I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. On the subject of, or just on? I hate to disappoint, so I'm doing both. My pleasure. Have you ever really looked at your hand? I tell that joke because according to lore, people high on marijuana are amazed by their limbs, often while slow-motion speed-eating Doritos in their parents' basement. I hate this joke because it invokes a stereotype that is reductive at best and supports a system of diabolical lies at worst. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is David Schmader, and I am a pothead. By this, I mean that when it comes time to enjoy an adult intoxicant, I will forego beer, wine, and spirits in favor of marijuana, which for me offers a world of nuanced delight and inspiration beyond the more crude effects of booze. But I'm not here to proselytize, and for a long time, I kept quiet about my own enjoyment of weed. It was illegal for most of the time I was enjoying it, and why make myself vulnerable as an out and proud lawbreaker if I didn't have to? I also dreaded being saddled with the stoner stereotype of having my every move interpreted through the lens of pothead, a label that calls up images of Mr. Magoo levels of forgetfulness and passivity bordering on the comatose. So what if I used weed not to escape, but to engage with art and ideas and food and dogs and hilariously terrible movies? Levels of forgetfulness. I was but one man, and I couldn't reconfigure society's image of the pothead all by myself. I stayed in the closet. And I'm familiar with the closet. I grew up gay in the pre-Ellen bad old days, when the only out gays were those who couldn't or didn't want to hide it. Drag queens and butch lesbians and gay bar raid victims whose faces wound up in newspapers. And these trailblazers might have been the whole of queer representation if Harvey Milk hadn't urged everyone to come out, especially all the non-remarkable queers who'd previously flown under the radar. Only then could an honest portrait of this subculture emerge. It's the same with weed. Only instead of drag queens and butches, weed's visibility parade is led by Cheech and Chong and Snoop Dogg and unlucky subjects of weed busts. And I love drag queens and Snoop Dogg. But leaving such exceptional outliers to do the heavy lifting of representation not only skews perception, it allows damaging lies to flourish. And the primary source of these lies is, unfortunately, the US government, which has strenuously vilified weed and its users for over 80 years. In 1930, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics declared, and I quote, "Marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes and makes darkies think they're as good as white men." This type of slander presented as science was codified in 1970, when the Controlled Substances Act scheduled marijuana as a Schedule I narcotic. a designation reserved for extremely dangerous drugs with no accepted medical use. It is hard to overstate the pernicious effects of this weed's Schedule I classification. For one thing, by scheduling weed as a dangerous drug with no medical benefit, the government makes it extremely difficult to conduct research that would prove that marijuana is a not very dangerous drug with a wealth of medical benefits. For example, to study allegedly less dangerous Schedule II drugs, scientists just, Schedule II drugs like cocaine or crystal meth, allegedly less dangerous, Schedule II, to study these drugs, scientists just whip up some crystal meth and study it. But to study Schedule I marijuana, researchers must be pre-approved by the FDA, apply for government-grown marijuana from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and be temporarily deputized by the DEA, as only federal agents are allowed to handle Schedule I narcotics. Add to this the fact that most funding for drug research comes from the pharmaceutical industry, which views weed as a threat and has a vested interest in keeping it labeled as a dangerous drug with no medical benefits. But as patients in 24 medical marijuana states can tell you, weed has a ton of medical benefits, from quashing nausea to minimizing arthritis pain to controlling seizure disorders. And in the face of all this cognitive dissonance, with the government's lies chafing against the actual experience of humans, speaking honestly about my own weed use seemed like the least I could do. So I started doing it. I'm a writer who often writes about myself, and being honest about weed was a lot like being honest about gayness. Both called for greater specificity. Instead of saying I was on a date, say I was out with a guy. When writing about celebrating with friends, mention the bong. When I started this Coming Out Stoner campaign, weed was still illegal where I lived. But I worked in an alternative news weekly that encouraged radical honesty and where I'd gotten high with the editor and publisher. Still, affixing myself with the stoner label was itchy, and I offset dread of stereotyping by stepping up my professional courtesy game. I was aggressively punctual, ostentatiously well organized, and as reasonably well motivated as every other person on Earth. And the world turned. Now it's 2015, and within a 5-mile radius of where you sit here in Seattle, there are a half dozen stores where anyone over 21 can purchase marijuana for recreational use. There are also a couple dozen dispensaries where authorized patients can buy marijuana for medicinal use. Meanwhile, 300 miles east, selling the small amount of marijuana for any reason can earn the seller a life sentence. An insane state of affairs summed up well by CNN's Mike Riggs. It should be cruel and unusual to mete out life without parole sentences for a drug so mainstream that Colorado is using state-collected pot taxes to build new schools. Yeah. And sorry about the note cards. I'm really bad at memorizing. So, we need to strive for integrity in our nation's pot laws. And a good first step is moving beyond the marijuana monster myths peddled by the feds. One such myth, marijuana is a gateway drug. No, it's not. The gateway drug theory holds that people that smoke weed are more likely to try harder drugs. But the main thing pushing weed smokers towards harder drugs are black market weed dealers selling harder drugs. The prohibition creates the connection. Another myth. People just want medical marijuana to get high. Shut up. The most exciting developments in medical marijuana involve strains that are incapable of making anyone high, opening a world of treatment for people who want their medicine without a side of stoned, like kids with seizure disorders. Also, it is fascinating how this people just want X to get high argument is never applied to prescription painkillers, which kill 10,000 people a year. Prescription painkillers kill 10,000 people a year while no one in the history of the world has ever died from marijuana. Another myth. Marijuana will make you stupid and maybe insane. This one's harder to dismiss. And not because it is true, but because it can be true for weed's most vulnerable potential users, which are kids. For those whose brains and bodies are still developing, marijuana can create a lifetime of problems, from diminished learning capacities to an enhanced chance of mental illness. And humans under 21 should not smoke or otherwise ingest marijuana. And actually, maybe even 21 is too young. If I were in charge, people wouldn't be able to start smoking weed until halfway through grad school. Speaking of white privilege, earlier I mentioned Seattle's many weed stores, all of them raking in huge legal profits on the same streets where earlier weed entrepreneurs earned prison sentences. And if recreational marijuana is ever to be a truly guilt-free pleasure, we need to rectify our nation's pot laws and do right by those whose lives were ruined by draconian war on drugs sentencing. For now, if you are someone who appreciates marijuana, either as medicine or diversion or both, come out. You don't need to cast yourself as a marijuana spokesmodel, but stop treating your weed-based pleasures as a source of shame to be kept secret. And the rest of you, stop lazily accepting the old stoner lore. I understand that we live in an age of fewer and fewer acceptable stereotypes, and we want to cherish those few we have left. But the stupid stoner one is just boring. Seriously, if I could get every weed-smoking surgeon and lawyer and New York Times best-selling author I know here with me on stage, and if we had spent the past couple weeks rehearsing the Thriller dance, we could blow your faces off. Thank you.
Factories? If you're like me, why don't we grow tomatoes in warehouses? Think about the word agriculture. Do you see images of smokestacks, concrete bunkers, factories? If you're like me, you probably see rows of leafy green plants thriving in the sunshine. Now think about the word grow up. Not exactly the same scene, is it? I'm Dan, and I'm humbled to be speaking in front of this audience today. My background is in business development, building teams in technology and finance. I've been lucky to offer the tools to bring ideas to operation in some cool sectors, like nuclear fuel, high-field magnetics, and software development. In 2012, I took notice of changing legislation around Canadian cannabis cultivation and started to build a team of some of British Columbia's leading agricultural scientists. Together, we've designed and built a facility that allows us to cultivate the plant legally, distributing it through a subscription service to medical patients. It's our business to know a lot about our product. And through my years of research on cannabis, I've come to a conclusion. On this continent, people love weed. North Americans consume cannabis with a voracious appetite. Tens of millions of people habitually smoke, dab, vape, patch, eat, and otherwise imbibe the contentious plant. However, cannabis has a dirty secret: a massive carbon footprint. This unexpected social cost of black market cannabis has no scientific rationale, but it does have a solution. To be clear, I'm not here to debate or persuade on the merits of past or present drug policy. The production of marijuana is becoming increasingly regulated, and as a result, we have a new ability to monitor and influence the methods that we use to grow it. We know, for instance, that 190,000 kilos of medical marijuana was produced in Canada alone in 2013. But how does this stack up against the black market, the production that we don't see? The estimates are staggering. Over 15 million kilograms of cannabis is produced and consumed across the broader population of North America every year. It dwarfs medical. We don't see. If this estimate is accurate, the black market cannabis revenues rival the beer industry. Tens of billions of dollars of untaxed and unregulated production. This dark market has some pretty obvious social costs, from funding cartels to a complete lack of quality assurance. One cost that I didn't expect is a big one. A carbon footprint that rivals heavy industrial manufacturing. This is because marijuana is not a field crop. It grows in basements, garages, and sheds. The billions of grams of annual production are fragmented into hundreds of thousands of tiny grows. They cultivate under artificial light and harvest not tons, but ounces at a time. As a result, the average grow-op looks more like the inside of a tanning bed than a farm. Today in North America, 90% of black market cannabis is grown indoors. This adds up to a startling demand for electricity. I love that cow. You guys catch that? In the state of California, for instance, an estimated 3% of total energy production goes to indoor cannabis cultivation. To put this in perspective, this is more annual electricity than is generated by the Hoover Dam, which supplements the energy needs of nearly 8 million people. Cultivating just 1 kilogram of cannabis from seed to harvest indoors requires the energy equivalent of driving a car from Los Angeles to New York 11 times. There is, however, a cultivation methodology that promises better plant health, lower costs, and a fractional environmental footprint. I believe that the only path to a sustainable future for commercial cannabis production lies in a technology that balances natural inputs with tight environmental control. The modern industrial greenhouse. Plants thrive in sunlight. They've evolved over billions of years to do just that. The sun provides a broader light spectrum and a higher light intensity than any artificial bulb. It is a lamp that has limitless and costless fuel for plant growth. In today's industrial greenhouse, the power of sunlight can be complemented with the environmental control of a laboratory. Over the last 50 years, greenhouses have evolved into streamlined, automated, and tightly controlled agricultural environments. If we moved all grow-ops into greenhouses today, we would save about 20 trillion watt-hours worth of energy every year. This is enough energy to electrify all the combined residences of Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco, all year long. Greenhouse cannabis production represents the opportunity to substitute billions of kilograms of carbon spewed into the atmosphere by the energy demand for indoor grows for millions of kilograms of carbon offset absorbed by the CO2-hungry cannabis plant. We don't grow tomatoes in warehouses. In fact, there's not a single crop on planet Earth that we grow indoors at scale. Unfortunately, we're seeing investment in regulated production infrastructure for cannabis that looks a lot like larger versions of the grow-ups of the black market. The dark past of the marijuana industry is influencing the future of regulated cannabis agriculture. I believe this is a critical mistake. Industrial greenhouse technology reduces energy consumption and reduces cost. The incentives for entrepreneurs and regulators are obvious. But you may ask yourself, how can I be a part of this conversation? Firstly, we as consumers need to seek sustainable products. If we care about a sustainable future, the companies that we support will care too. We see the sustainability demand play out in the growth of cool companies like Whole Foods and Tesla. There's every reason the consumption trends honoring sustainability are relevant for the cannabis industry as well. Secondly, cannabis cultivators need to carefully consider the infrastructure that they build. Embracing greenhouses means financial competitiveness and sustainability on a 10-year time horizon. If you work in cannabis, know this: the future is sun-grown. Finally, regulators have a crucial role to play to implement forward-thinking environmental policy around cannabis cultivation. We already motivate the teams that build our commercial and industrial infrastructure to think long-term with incentives like green building standards and tax. If sustainable sun-grown cannabis cultivation is incentivized by governments, the growers of tomorrow will have every reason to cultivate with the health of the planet as a priority. I challenge you to start this conversation at your dinner table and at your water cooler. Talk to your local representatives about where they stand at the dawn of what could be a massive industry. Demand sustainability in cannabis or otherwise, and entrepreneurs will rise to the challenge. Thank you.
My name is Hillary Bricken. I'm a lawyer from How many of you know what Initiative 502 is? Please raise your hands. Don't sweat it if you don't. It's our state's legalization measure that passed in 2012, and it legalizes cannabis for adults 21 and up. Now, how many of you voted for 502? Get them up. Okay? And not to insult anyone's intelligence, but how many of you know that marijuana is still federally illegal? All right? And more importantly, and more to the point, how many of you think it shouldn't be? That is not a surprise. Thank you for that. My name is Hillary Bricken. I'm a lawyer from Seattle, and all I do all day, every day, is help entrepreneurs navigate the cannabis industry here in the Pacific Northwest and outside the region in different states. And while you might think it is tremendously sexy to do nothing but talk pot 24/7, I assure you it does get old at some point, but not today. Because today, we talk about the power and polarity, the best of both worlds, namely, can we have the repeal of federal marijuana prohibition without installing big marijuana in its place? And more importantly, is state legal marijuana creating big marijuana? I ask that you keep those two questions in the forefronts of your minds as I go through my talk. Now, in order to get to the answer to those questions, I have to give you a little bit of a backdrop of what's happened between the states and the feds over the years. This is a map behind me of the 23 plus states that have some form of legal marijuana reform on the books. This slide also contains the states that this year will have ballot initiatives to legalize cannabis for adults. Now, you might be thinking, how can the states opt out of federal marijuana prohibition? How is this even possible? And it really hinges on a few simple principles, the main one of which is that none of these states and their laws require anybody to actually violate federal law. It is purely voluntary. And you too, out of your own volition, in some of these states could start a cannabis business taking the risk every day that the federal government would not come in and enforce the law against you. Now, the feds have not been entirely silent on the issue over the years. Since 2009, they've issued a series of enforcement memoranda telling U.S. attorneys how to apply federal law in states that have state legal marijuana. The most important, most relevant memo issued in 2013 by then acting Deputy U.S. Attorney General James M. Cole. And that memo has specific ramifications, and it's very important to this topic of big marijuana because it says a few things that are relevant. The first one of which is that the federal government will not waste money or manpower going into federal court trying to sue the states to overturn their legal marijuana regimes. The second one is that finally the federal government has articulated 8 enforcement priorities that it will make its goals in states with legal marijuana, and those range from not dealing drugs to kids, not diverting product out of state and out of the country, and finally not dealing with the drug cartels or other internationally illegal enterprises. At the same time, what this memo says in between the lines is that to a certain extent, the federal government is going to tolerate these democratic experiments, but if and only if the states have robust enough regulation to govern and control commercial cannabis activity. And if the states don't, the federal government will not remain at bay. They will come in with the full power of the Constitution behind them, and they will enforce laws accordingly in these states. Now, what has robust regulation given us? Because it is key, right? It is key to state legalization and success. It is also key to the building up and building out of big marijuana, which is a total irony. But this is pretty much what we're used to, right? These iconic images that we know and love. I know myself, I'm a huge Big Lebowski fan. And while the dude abides, I do not think the dude was ready or prepared for the 21st century of cannabis under a robust regulatory regime. So what has robust regulation given us? Okay, now between these two slides, it may surprise you, These are the products that are currently in Washington's marijuana marketplace. You can see, this is no longer your daddy's grass, right? When we talk about oils, topicals, tinctures, lotions, etc., we are now talking about the majority of products in the marijuana marketplace. And as you can see, they're heavily packaged, heavily labeled, there's more transparency than ever, and there's more corporate accountability than ever for the people who make these things. So if anything, robust regulation has given us products that are probably more diverse, more dynamic, certainly safer, unfortunately probably more expensive, but ultimately of a better quality in some respects. Robust regulation has also given us barriers to entry, so much so that at this point only a certain type of entrepreneur with a certain amount of money is really participating on a really easy level. Some examples of those barriers to entry are traceability requirements, product tracking requirements, packaging and labeling requirements, land use buffer, landlord requirements. We have financial requirements and criminal background checks. If anybody in here is a convicted felon, don't even waste your time applying to own or operate one of these businesses in most of these states because you will never be eligible to do so. Now, what does this mean? How does this culminate in the industry? What it means is that right now, only the strong are surviving. And who are the strong? Really two groups. Those who are well capitalized and those with deep and vast political connections in order to exert influence. And that begs the question, because now, on both the state and the federal and even the local level, we have pot packs. And God forbid we actually have pot lobbyists. Yes, that is a job now. So again, it begs the question, is state legal marijuana as a result of robust regulation creating big marijuana? And I posit to you that the answer is yes. So who is big marijuana, right? Who do you run from? Who do you criticize? Where do you invest your money? What is a safe bet in this extremely volatile industry? In my opinion, it's really four main groups, all of which in some way are trying to control and dominate the industry by making it more commercial and industrial than ever. These are no longer people growing weed in their backyard or in their mom's basement. The four groups are states with monopolies that promote anti-competitive behavior, most of the businesses in the recreational cannabis states, ancillary businesses that support the industry but don't touch the product or the plant, and finally, my personal favorite, celebrity pot and brands and endorsements. So let's talk about each one in turn. States with monopolies that promote anti-competitive behavior, unfortunately, from my perspective, are becoming the norm. And by legislative design and on purpose, what is happening is that these states really only want a certain kind of business person participating in their jurisdictions. In all of the states behind me, which I consider to be the repeat offenders, what's been available and what's been proposed, very few number of licenses that are typically vertically integrated, meaning you have to cultivate, process, and distribute it yourself, where you absolutely control the price and you exclusively control who can access the product. Florida is a very good example. In this state, by legislative action, what was available? 5 licenses in the entire state to control the 5 regions of Florida. And in order to even get a license, you had to have been a plant nursery in existence in the state for no less than 30 years. I know. And I'm from Florida, people. I mean, this is terrible. At the same time, though, you can see this is a very small group of people to wield a tremendous amount of control over a really big state and a really popular industry. Now, what's happening in the recreational marijuana states oftentimes, really the incentive is to put profit before people, because robust regulation is creating a huge bottom line. It is more expensive than ever to run one of these businesses, and in order to survive, you not only want to make your investment back, but you want to be profitable in order to comply with the regulations. The other thing is that there's a tremendous amount of competition. There is a huge amount of saturation. So you have every motivation to develop routine customers with regular habits to ensure survival. We also know that between Colorado and Washington, there's huge demand for the product. I mean, that's a no-brainer. In 2014 and 2015, in both states, between those years, they did about $70 million in tax revenue, which you're probably thinking, that's not that big of a deal. But in Colorado, that outpaced alcohol, which only did $42 million. And here in Washington, even though we only collected $70 million, we sold over $257 million of pot. So super high demand being filled by mostly money-incentivized companies who are trying to survive and be highly competitive. Now, moving on to ancillary businesses, these guys are special. They're not necessarily violating federal law, which means they're not subject to robust regulation, and they have way less federal oversight than, let's say, a marijuana business does. These guys, as a result, can do things, and they're more liberal than cannabis businesses are. For example, they can get a bank account, right? Because of federal law, banks will not launder money on behalf of illegal entities. So these guys can get a bank account. They can do more than that. They can get funding, institutional investors. They can get a bank loan. They can develop highbrow branding that they can protect to the full extent of federal law. Very different than a cannabis business. Now, these 4 businesses that I have behind me are at the intersection of where marijuana meets technology, okay? Hi There is considered the Tinder of cannabis. So if you want a hot pot date, feel free to swipe right on Hi There. Then we have Mass Roots, which is really the Instagram of marijuana. If you've got big buds and a Polaroid, that's where you would go. Weed Maps is like the Yelp of cannabis. If you have a favorite or least favorite dispensary, that's where you would go to review it. And finally, Leafly, which is really the equivalent of the WebMD of the pot world. And each of those tiles behind me, they represent a strain, and they will tell you not only what they do to you, but where you can find it and how much it costs. Now, interestingly about Leafly, they are owned by a joint venture firm here in Washington State, and they were able to secure a multi-million-dollar bid from Peter Thiel's Founders Fund. Peter Thiel being the founder of PayPal and one of the first outside investors in Facebook, whose personal mantra has been monopolies are best for business. So I will let you draw your own conclusions from that. Finally, on to celebrity pot brands and endorsements. Behind me, this kind of effect works just like any other commodity. For example, if you were a basketball player and you wanted to up your game, you might buy those shoes that LeBron or Steph Curry is wearing in order to do that. And it's no different with pot. If you want to be like these celebrities, have their lifestyle, maybe have some of their success, you're going to smoke what they smoke and use what they use. And clearly we have some of the usual suspects that are already in the game. I have behind me Tommy Chong, whose main marquee strain is Chong Star. Then there's Leafs by Snoop, which is supposedly a medical marijuana brand whose trade slogan is medicate, elevate, and lift it up. Then we have Marley Natural, my personal favorite, and ironically, Marley Natural, maybe not so ironically, is actually owned by the same joint venture firm that owns Leafly, and they are the world's first self-proclaimed worldwide marijuana brand. And finally, we have Willie's Reserve, for you Willie Nelson fans. And if you're a music lover, cannabis connoisseur, Willie tells you about his pot. This is legendary. Now, in order for you to experience firsthand this celebrity pot epidemic, if that's how you want to see it, I would like you to watch this commercial that recently dropped from Marley Natural.
In Bob Marley's vision for a better world, one united by love, respect, and social justice, he advocates for the positive power of the earth. To liberate our creativity, to encourage our reflection, and as the healing of the nation. Inspired by his deep respect for nature, for its power to awaken our well-being, we embark on a new chapter of his legacy. To realize more fully in the world the many benefits of cannabis for the mind, body, and spirit. Make way for the positive day.
Now, if the ghost of Bob Marley can't sell you the herb, I don't know what's wrong with y'all, right? And that is the point. Because what I heard a lot about in that commercial was how cannabis can reveal you to yourself. It has reinvention qualities. I heard a lot about social justice, healing, love, and respect. And I heard even more about Bob Marley's legacy and lifestyle. But what I didn't hear about were side effects, drug interactions, the potential for addiction, if any. I heard nothing about science and data, and I'm pretty sure that that was by design. So what has the opposition to legalization, what have they said about this concept of big marijuana? Well, they have locked into it hook, line, and sinker. These two ads ran about a week apart in the New York Times, no less. Okay, that's the level at which we're operating now. The one on the left was run by Leafly, and the one on the right was run by a prohibitionist group called grassisnotgreener.com. Now, what Leafly is trying to do, they're trying to use a play on words from the drug war rhetoric of the 80s and the 90s. Just say no. And what Leafly wants you to know is that functioning adults that contribute to society can use cannabis in their everyday lives and the sky will not fall. Here we have two seemingly normal people, one exercising, one presumably going to or coming from work, and they're both using cannabis to treat their medical issues in their daily life. The important takeaway is that they are not serial killers, they are not psychopaths, and more importantly, they are not stoners. That is the message from Leafly. Now on the right, the opposition is playing a completely different game. What they are trying to tell you is that the perception of the cannabis industry on its face is that it is perfectly harmless. But the reality is that the people behind legalization that are pushing for it, they care about nothing but anything but profits, right? And we have the boardroom and the power suit to prove it. And the main message is that the flower child of the past has been replaced by the Wall Street power broker of today. And that the only thing that matters is profit, everything else be damned. And in this ad specifically, they compared the industry to the big tobacco industry. And the prohibitionists think that this is a super persuasive conversation to have, that most Americans haven't even thought about it, and that it is a huge deterrent, if not the deterrent, to legalization. Now locally in Washington State, our Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board, which oversees our entire marijuana program, they are dealing with a big marijuana issue. Right now, if you want to invest in, gift money to, or lend money to any of these cannabis businesses, you have to have 6 months of residency, which has kept the industry a little cottage for a little bit longer. Well, because the businesses are trying to comply with robust regulation, that requires cash flow. So they want money from outside investors, namely out of state and maybe even from overseas. In the long run, that's probably a good thing. We want them to have this money because we want them to survive, to show the federal government that a taxation and regulation model is superior to prohibition. Now, at the same time, I think we should be a little worried about this money coming in where there's probably not going to be a lot of connectivity with our communities, where they may not care about or be aware of the communal impact, the societal cost of the expansion of these businesses, how it affects our youth and our relationships with each other. And the Liquor Board is constantly weighing these issues of corporate versus cottage. Notably, they have not adopted any outside investment rule yet, but they are considering it. Finally, on the national level, the states hold all the cards. They are in absolute control, and they are and will be the arbiters of the fate of big marijuana. Congress has been willfully ignorant on the issue, despite the fact that for the first time in history, more than half of Americans want legalization of marijuana, and the Department of Justice has opted to stand down in the face of robust regulation. In addition, this is not the state's first rodeo, right? They've done this before. They did it with alcohol, with its prohibition and repeal, or just like today with cannabis, differing and varying state models of taxing and regulating alcohol ultimately culminated in the repeal of federal alcohol prohibition. And that really is amazing. This is how our democracy is supposed to work. This is how we test the separation of powers, okay? This is how the states are supposed to operate in relationship to the federal government. But again, it is a little troubling because just like those in federal power, our state and local lawmakers, they too are susceptible to the charms of big business. And why is that the case? Because big business has sufficient skin in the game. They have the money, the manpower, and the resources to meet and exceed robust regulation, to surmount barriers to entry, to contribute handily and readily to campaign funds and elections, to control and influence the laws and regulations that govern their business, and probably most importantly, to drive up and capture more tax revenue as a result of capturing a bigger market share. So when we talk about the best of both worlds, I am not sure that we can even get to the repeal of federal marijuana prohibition without some kind of partnership with big marijuana. Because quickly what's happening is that in these states with robust regulation, to appease the federal government, the only entities oftentimes that are even capable of participating or eligible to participate are the big ones. And I don't know about you, but while I much prefer the Rasta lifestyle and dreadlocks to, let's say, cowboy boots and saddle burn, I think at this point, we all need to be asking ourselves what we should be doing as a community and what the industry should be doing to make sure that Marley country does not become Marlboro country. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention and your time. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
An easy answer. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm a researcher. I study drugs and human behavior. So I'm really interested in who uses drugs, what drugs they're using, why do they use them, And what are the consequences for mental health? And like a lot of people in the past couple of years, my team and I have been turning our attention towards cannabis. And we've conducted a series of studies of medical and recreational cannabis users. So one question that people often ask me when they find out that I research recreational and therapeutic cannabis use is, how can you tell the difference? What's the difference between recreational and medical use? And I think that's a great question because it raises some really important issues about just how porous the barriers can be between well-being, health, and pleasure. And I don't think there's really an easy answer. I don't think there's going to be one sort of objective criteria that we can use to distinguish medical from recreational use. There are people out there who have conditions that respond very well to cannabis-based medicines, and they might still use cannabis a lot of the time because they like the way it makes them feel. There are also people who might not think of themselves as medical users, but they get substantial symptom relief from using cannabis. People with back pain who smoke a joint before they go to bed and find that they can get through the night with a good sleep undisturbed by pain, even though they're having a bit of a flare-up. But for a lot of people, it is clear-cut. They have serious and severe symptoms and illnesses that they treat effectively with cannabis and cannabis-based medicines. And they don't like the feeling. It's an unwelcome side effect. For a lot of people, it's both. They treat very legitimate symptoms using cannabis medicines, and maybe they like some of the other aspects as well. But whether it's recreational or therapeutic or both, what we do know is that a lot of adults in Canada choose to use cannabis. They weigh the costs and the benefits, and they make a reasonable and rational choice to use cannabis. It's well over half of Canadians across their lifetime, and about 20% of us in the past year. So if so many Canadian adults are making this rational choice, what's the big deal? Why do we have this complex and conflicted, fearful relationship with this ancient plant? I think that's really the important question. How did we get where we are today? And where might we go from here? And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about where we are with cannabis. You know, when we think about our relationship with the cannabis plant, we tend to have very short memories. A lot of us will start off, with some of the cultural changes of the 1960s. Jerry Garcia. Some of us will even go back to the 1950s and jazz culture. But really, if we want to think about our relationship between human beings and cannabis, we have to go back a whole lot further than that. This is a pictographic representation of hemp plants being hung out to dry. It's about 5,000 years old. It comes from Central Asia. And that's where our best estimates of early human use of cannabis come from, several thousand years ago in Asia. And whether that use was medical, whether it was spiritual, whether it was just for fun, I don't think we really know. It's an ongoing debate. But what we do know is that this is a very old relationship. By some estimates, cannabis was the first cultivated plant. You could say that cannabis and human beings grew up together. Cannabis has been described as a camp follower. It's a plant that follows human beings wherever we go, and wherever we disturb the earth and make a place for it to take root. Cannabis can, of course, grow wild, but it doesn't mind some help. And for most of our many millennia-long relationship, we've gotten along pretty well. Even as recently as just a little over 100 years ago, Queen Victoria was using cannabis extracts for therapeutic purposes. But like any long relationship, there have been ups and downs. And cannabis and human beings had a bit of a falling out around the 1930s. That's when you first see the term marijuana become popular. It was a term that was coined by cannabis prohibitionists to make the familiar cannabis plant seem foreign and scary. That's why I don't favor that term. I like to think that my great-grandchildren won't recognize it. And if they do, they'll laugh when they hear marijuana. And I'm pretty sure that they're going to look back on our current era as a strange and confusing time of misunderstanding. So, since we've had this falling out, cannabis and people, how have we both fared? I mean, we're both distinct species with our own biological imperatives. So, what has this interspecies battle meant for people and for the cannabis plant? It's been noted that the psychoactive resin of the cannabis plant, the part that has most of the medical properties, the part that people use to get high, it's been proposed that evolved to protect and cool the seeds. And that's certainly true. But when we think about how much help the cannabis plant has got from people, we can imagine that the resin may have evolved to serve other purposes as well. The writer Michael Pollan, in a great TED Talk from a couple of years ago, encourages us to take a plant's eye view of things, to try to see things from the plant's perspective. And I think that perspective can be really helpful when we try to estimate what the impact of this battle has been on the evolutionary path of the cannabis plant. I think when we take this plant's eye perspective, particularly here in BC, it seems like the cannabis plant is doing pretty well. It's not native to this region, but it grows widely throughout the area. You know, I think that if I were to take the perspective of another plant species, one that is native to BC, the ponderosa pine. So if I was a ponderosa pine and I had an ego and a self-reflective consciousness, I think I'd be a little aggravated when I looked at the cannabis plant. You know, there used to be stands of ponderosa pine, and now there are caverns and basements full of cannabis. So it seems like cannabis is having a bit of a moment. You know, and not only has cannabis gained a whole lot of territory over the last several decades, it's also diversified. The number of distinct and robust strains of cannabis has skyrocketed over the last couple decades. So in the 75 years or so since people declared war on cannabis, the cannabis plant is bigger, better, and stronger than ever. So how have people fared since we started this battle? What's it meant for us as a species? And I think it's cost us dearly. It certainly cost us a lot in resources. The most recent estimates from the US suggest that the cost of cannabis prohibition is over $40 billion per year. That's over $10 billion in enforcement, $30 billion in lost revenue. And we can imagine that it's proportionally similar here in Canada. But the cost hasn't only been economic, of course. It's been a terrible cost in terms of human misery and suffering. Countless families have been disrupted by crime and by incarceration. And a lot of those come from some of our most vulnerable communities. On top of that, until very recently, we've been deprived of a very safe and effective medicine. So, if we look at this as a zero-sum game, it seems that cannabis is coming out way ahead, and people are really on the losing end. And as much as I respect and admire the cannabis plant, I'm a human psychologist, not a plant psychologist. So my job is to support human health and well-being. And so I'm compelled to imagine a different way that we can maybe tip the scales back in favor of humanity. What would it look like if we called a truce with cannabis, as we seem tantalizingly close to doing? So my team and I just published a study looking at over 600 medical cannabis users from across the country. These are people with many of the conditions that characterize the use of cannabis for therapeutic purposes. People with serious conditions like cancer, AIDS, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, chronic pain. And what we found was that in addition to treating some of the distinct features of these disorders, people were using cannabis for three primary reasons: to help sleep, to reduce pain, and to alleviate anxiety. These are things that so many of us seek treatment for. And our medicine cabinets are full of pharmaceutical products that are designed to treat these very symptoms. Our team was particularly interested in the co-occurrence of anxiety and pain. We know these things go very close together, that anxiety and pain really make each other worse. So we conducted a follow-up study that focused on people who use cannabis to treat anxiety and pain together. And what we found is that cannabis was most effective amongst individuals who were anxious, in pain, and were trying hard to cope effectively with that pain. Cannabis was least effective for people who used avoidant and self-blaming type of coping. We also found that among the people for whom cannabis was most effective, nearly 80% reported that cannabis allowed them to be more active despite the pain. And over 85% said that cannabis helped them to think less about the pain. And that makes a lot of sense given what we now know about how cannabis works in the brain. A few decades ago, neuroscientists discovered that we have our own system in our brains and throughout our bodies that is uniquely tuned to working with cannabis and cannabis-like substances. It's called the endocannabinoid system. And we've also found that there's a concentration of activity of this cannabis system in the amygdala. That's the part of the brain that's focused on processing anxiety, fear, and the emotional content of fear. And the activity of the cannabis in the amygdala raises a lot of really interesting possibilities. We spend billions and billions of dollars every year on pharmaceutical medications designed to treat anxiety, and our existing medications are problematic for a number of reasons. So our team is also really interested in how cannabis might work for anxiety amongst people who don't also have pain conditions. We just wrapped up a study led by my student Kim Crosby looking at anxiety, cannabis use, and psychological well-being amongst college students. And we found something that was pretty surprising, something that runs counter to what you might expect to see in studies of substance use and mental health. The frequent cannabis users in our study, those who used cannabis 2 or more times a week, were less anxious than the non-users, and they were less sensitive to the anxiety that they did have. They worried less, and they worried less about their worrying. So maybe if we can make peace with cannabis, it can help us to start make peace with ourselves, at least for some people. I think it's worth looking into. So if we can start to see cannabis as a tool for assisting with our mental health, what's next? Well, the best studies have yet to be done. Studies that side by side compare cannabis with other popular medicines to treat anxiety. And the reason those studies haven't been done is largely due to barriers that have been set up by governments over the last couple decades as part of the war on drugs. Fortunately, this is all starting to change. Just a few weeks ago, the United States Department of Health and Human Services gave a green light to the first clinical trial of cannabis for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, one of the most severe and debilitating of the anxiety disorders. So it's a very exciting time. And if we can start to use cannabis in this way, what's next? I think there are a lot of other plant medicines that we could make peace with and that might help us with our well-being. Among the most promising is psilocybin, also known as magic mushrooms. A recent study found that just a few treatments with psilocybin help people reduce anxiety and depression when they're dealing with terminal illness. There's also an ongoing study looking at the effectiveness of psilocybin for treating obsessive-compulsive disorder. So this is a really exciting time for those of us who are interested in the psychotherapeutic potential of ancient plant medicines like cannabis, like psilocybin, like ayahuasca. There's new studies coming out all the time, and the rate of discovery is accelerating rapidly. What this might mean in a more broad sense is that in the coming years and decades, we may have access to some of the very same medicines that our ancestors used effectively for millennia. It might also mean that we might be able to start to address some of our mental health concerns using our gardens or greenhouses. And I think that in itself could be tremendously empowering. It could also help us to reduce the tremendous environmental cost of producing and disposing of tons and tons of pharmaceutical products into our land and water. And finally, I think it means that the drug talk we're going to have with our kids will be a lot more fact-based and straightforward than the drug talk that many of us got as kids. Thank you very much.
Now, those of you out Hey, look, if you guys are anything like me, you have found it harder and harder to turn around recently without seeing words like free range, farm to table, organically produced, especially here in Colorado. Now, as we've become more conscientious of the way that we eat in recent years, these once unfamiliar words have worked their way into our daily lexicon. When we started to pay more attention to the way that the food we were eating interacted with our bodies and with the earth, the food industry had to listen. And the results have been really powerful. Words like all natural and homegrown are not just being used in our diets. There's this whole new industry using this language now. Now, those of you out there from states like Washington and Oregon, and of course my fellow Coloradans, y'all know what I'm talking about. It's weed. An industry that taxed a sale of about $6 billion worth of product in 2016. So what if I were to propose to you that some of what you think you know about this legalized marijuana thing could be wrong? Listen, I get it. Talking about issues with legal weed is a pretty quick way to get uninvited from the cool kids table. I know that better than most, but I intend to do it anyway. First, before I get started, let me be perfectly clear about one thing. My fight is not against the casual adult use of marijuana. I don't care about that. What I care deeply about is this new industry that is working to convince us that we are consuming something natural while fixing social ills when we aren't. So let's start with a little bit of Weed 101. Cannabis is a plant that grows naturally and has been used within textiles and even traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years. Genesis 1:12 even tells us that I have given you all of the seed-bearing plants and herbs to use. It's the microphone. It's kind of TV preacher sort of thing. Now, cannabis is made up of hundreds of different chemicals, but two of those chemicals are by far the most interesting. That's CBD and THC. So CBD is where almost all of the medicinal properties lie. It's an incredibly fascinating part of the plant with real potential to help people. It also is totally non-intoxicating. You can take a bath in the stuff while vaping pure CBD and drinking a CBD smoothie, and you still couldn't get high. I've tried. I haven't. That cost a lot of money. Now, for as interesting and remarkable a part of the plant as CBD is, it actually makes up a really tiny portion of the commercial market. The real money is being made in that other chemical, in THC. So THC is the natural part of the plant that gets you high. And before the 1970s, cannabis contained less than 0.5% of THC. That's what's naturally occurring. Over the last 40 years, as we became better gardeners, that percentage of THC started to slowly but steadily rise. Until recently, when the chemists started to get involved. These guys move cultivation exclusively indoors, and they make grow cycles extremely and unnaturally short. They also started to use pesticides and fertilizers in some ways that we should be concerned with. In fact, I was recently talking to a buddy who had just left a job in a commercial grow operation because he was so concerned with the chemicals that he was being asked to interact with. Some of his fellow employees were actually encouraged to wear hazmat suits while they were spraying their chemical cocktails on the plants. With that kind of manipulation, the products that are being sold today can contain above 30% THC. And our concentrates can actually contain above 95% THC, a far cry from the natural plant. Listen, this isn't your grandpa's weed. This isn't your dad's weed. Like this isn't even my weed. If you've ever set foot inside one of the thousands of dispensaries that have sprung up in recent years, you know that what we're really selling in them is THC. All of the weed that you buy commercially lists exactly how much THC it contains, as do our other much more popular products like vape pens, coffee, ice cream, condiments, granola, gum, candy, baked goods, suppositories, and of course, lube. Pretty much, no, for real. Pretty much anything that you can imagine introducing into the human body. The vast majority of cannabis that's being sold today, it isn't really cannabis. It's THC in either a pure form or in an extremely high and unnatural concentration. To say that we have legalized weed is subtly misleading. We have commercialized THC. And it's happened really quickly. Now, the reason why the commercial market has so rapidly exploded is because there is a hell of a lot of money to be made in satisfying and increasing our desire to get high. And that money is no longer really being made by the mom and pop shops. So industry groups and corporations, groups like the Drug Policy Alliance, the Marijuana Policy Project, ArcView Investment, the Cannabis Industry Association, they've chased out and helped to chase out a lot of the small-time growers. So these cats know that the best way to get us to continue to profit off of us is if they follow the alcohol industry's 80-20 rule. That's simple. It's where 80% of the product is consumed by 20% of the consumers, the problemed users. The wealthy, white weed lobbyists, and seriously, they are almost all rich white men. They know that we will consume more of what they're selling if they jack up the potency. They also know that we are more than twice as likely to consume THC regularly if we earn under $50,000 a year if we earn under $20,000 a year than those who earn over $50,000 a year. In other words, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to spend your money on their products. And in this country, income and race are highly correlated. One of the reasons that we often hear cited for the legalization of marijuana is that it will help to stop the disproportionate incarceration rates among minorities, which is something everybody in this room should be extremely concerned with. Unfortunately, we don't have to look any further than arrest rates for juveniles here in Colorado to counter that argument. According to the Colorado Department of Public Safety, since we opened retail in 2014, almost all of which are in poor minority neighborhoods, we saw an 8% reduction in the arrest of white kids for all weed-related activity. Good on them. During that same time period, there's a 29% increase in the arrest of Hispanic kids for weed-related activity and a 58% increase in the arrest of black kids for weed-related crimes. You guys heard that, right? We are actually arresting more people of color in Colorado than we were prior to commercialization. And you're not reading that in the Post. Another big issue that we have is in school suspension rates. So, schools that are predominantly white, that is, they have a minority population of 25% or fewer. In the first full year of data collection following commercialization, These schools had a grand total of 190 drug-related suspensions, almost all of which are for THC. At the same time, schools with a minority population of 75 to 100% had 801 drug-related suspensions, almost all of which were for THC. When discussing minority populations, one that unfortunately often gets left out of the conversation is the LGBTQ community. Now, members of this community are more than twice as likely to consume THC than those who identify as heterosexual or cisgender. They also, unfortunately, have higher rates of mental illness and suicide. According to a study published in 2014 called Going to Pot, we see that the unnaturally high levels of THC found in today's products, they actually compound those issues and make them worse. Unfortunately, that seems to matter very little to the folks who are selling these products because, as you just saw, clearly this is a good consumer base. Listen, man, I get it. In many circles, legalized marijuana is too much of a sacred cow to question. But we need to start this conversation because what's being sold today is not natural, and lobbyists in industry are using social justice as a smokescreen so that they can get richer. It's been my own journey to sobriety that led me to begin questioning a lot of what I was seeing. That's kind of one of the things that we're taught to do. When I left Boulder for the Washington, D.C. area at 12 years old, man, I was transported into a world where the kind of shoes that you wore mattered more than just about anything else. And my family was just too poor to help me play that game. So I was faced with a pretty real crisis of identity. In this new scene where there's more blacktop than treetops, man, I just didn't know who I was. So I smoked weed for the first time when I was 13, and I loved it. I instantly found this social group, and I also just really liked being high. Like, I finally found a way to shut this up. I quickly turned to other drugs and alcohol, and something just woke up inside of my brain. I was a daily user within a couple of months. So my addictive use, it mirrors many of the stories that I'm sure you've heard before. It started out as fun, it got scary, and then it was just necessary. Enough said. I got wasted for the last time on June 15th of 1996. And Thank you. And I've spent the last 21 years trying to both put my life back in order as well as trying to find some peace in this world. And one of the ways that I've done that is by working inside of nonprofit drug and alcohol treatment for the last 10 years with groups like Phoenix Multisport, the University of Colorado Hospital, and NowGap, the National Association for Lesbian, Gay, Transgender, Bisexual Treatment Providers and their allies. Even after all of my work on the front lines, and as a former consumer myself, I was shocked and pissed when I started to see what commercialization was doing to cannabis, because you see, our hope for something pure and natural is making it hard for us to see what's really going on. And that is that the rich are getting richer on the backs of the poor and lying to our faces the entire time. Thank you. My friends, once again, I fear that we are allowing industry to take advantage of the most challenged among us in order to turn a profit, much like we saw with tobacco and food in years past. So when we told the food industry that we understood the impact our choices were having and that we demanded better for ourselves and our families, and that industry got into line. So is there any reason why we couldn't demand the same thing from this and from future industries who are trying to get a piece of our paychecks? What if we made these guys answer some hard questions? What if we held them to a higher standard than we are right now? Because as it stands, for many in our community, the grass isn't greener on this side of commercialization. They've just been sold a bag of goods. Thank you.